I'm here to talk about this intersection of our stories and health and the environment. And I do think that it's very important to hear these stories in depth because they are so complicated, and there are very few people who have the patience and the expertise and the interest to be able to listen to these stories and then advocate. And we can't advocate correctly or efficiently unless we incorporate this into our strategy. So next slide, please. So I'm going to, in light of Bill S5, the right to live in a healthy environment, and Bill C-226, development of a strategy to address environmental racism and injustice, I want to describe where I'd like to know where can we collect these community stories to inform Bill C-226. We have to have a place to inform the strategy so that it can include our voices. And I'd like to do that by describing briefly the story of Akwesasne in four parts: pre-industrial, industrial, the sequelae, and new concerns regarding environment and the health and the community. And then, of course, this would underlie the rationale for CAPE making the Indigenous caucus. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about Akwesasne. This is where my father is from. This is where I now work. I've been a family doctor. Now I'm in my 17th year. I previously worked in Ganhawage, and now I'm in Akwesasne. Akwesasne, we've been here for a very long time. We are now, in this peculiar position where the 45th parallel goes right through our community. And so, of course, the American-Canadian border bisects our community. And on the Canadian side, we have the Ontario and Quebec border. So we have actually three different jurisdictions, which includes three provincial and state jurisdictions, as well as two federal jurisdictions, as well as the Northern Indian Affairs Band Council system, and on the southern side, the Bureau of Indian Affairs federal system. So we have all sorts of jurisdictions that are complicating how we look at what we're talking about today. And if we can figure out how to advocate for here and understand this story, then we will be able to recognize and understand the stories that are happening across Canada. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Akwesasne is this beautiful area. We just upstream from us on our territory, there was these huge sets of rapids. It drops 80 feet. There's huge number of islands, the 1,000 islands, lots of biodiversity, very deep waters and shallow waters, and fast and slow moving. So lots and lots of fish. We've got lots of wetlands. This was an area, if you look at the map of North America, where big game could swim easily across the St. Lawrence River, the Ganyat-Darawanano, which is the St. Lawrence River, the Great River. So this was a very special place for the traffic of human and non-human animals, as well as the plant species that were here. And so we, having been here for, since time immemorial, we actually could sustain ourselves quite efficiently. And our men also went off to work in the big cities in the American bridges and skyscraper projects over the past 70 years. And so we were really very, very self-sustaining. Next slide, please. However, to be able to capture the kinetic and potential energy of this huge Ganyat-Darawanano fall rapids, they made the Moses Saunders Power Dam in the 1950s. And what this did was it attracted 6 huge factories that basically encircled our community, most of them being upwind, downriver and downwind from these factories. And so within 5 years of one particular or two particular industries, we noticed some very big changes happening with with the health of our animals and things like honeybees. And so we asked for, a veterinary to come and look at our animals. We had a huge dairy industry, and we noticed that the animals were having stillbirths. They were losing their teeth. They were losing muscle mass, and they weren't able to to gain weight and have offspring, and it was very, very disturbing because we were taking such good care of them, and now all of a sudden we weren't able to. We were gaslit, and it took 17 years after being told over and over, it's you guys don't know how to take care of your animals. You're doing something wrong. Finally, we had an independent observer come in from Cornell University and was here for 2 hours and said, you have severe fluorosis here. And that began this whole investigation into the pollution around our community. And so since then, we've had a whole bunch of research. We've had a lot of advisories as how we are to interact with the earth and the water. And now we, for the most part, we are not able to safely interact with our environment. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, lots and lots of different types of research were done, and this is a good map describing some of the research that was done. And they basically found that we have an incredible amount of PCBs, lead, mercury, dioxins, aluminum, fluorine. And they found the relationship of these chemicals were related to detrimental effects like cancers, autoimmune disease, endocrine disorders, neurological effects, such as cognitive and mental health dysfunction and disequilibrium. Next slide, please. And so since we have had a complete change in our relationship to the land, we have lost a big part of the transmission of our culture and our language. And we have been forced to accept other economic ventures. There has been this huge cleanup, but it has been it has been extensive, but very incomplete. And since this huge amount of research that happened in the 90s, the research has pretty much stopped, and we have not been doing prospective data collection. And even though in the community there's this general acknowledgement that there are elevated rates of cancer, diabetes, and other health conditions, this is only anecdotal because we don't have the data, and our EMR has not been designed to capture any of this data. One of the important things that these children who played in this soup of unregulated pollution are now in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and they are presenting with really, really ill health and very complicated internal medicine type presentations in my family medicine, general medicine clinic. Next slide, please. So we know that the chronic exposure to industrial man-made carcinogenic, neurotoxic, endocrine disrupting PCB molecules that we find in our surrounding water and soils has really resulted in some problems anecdotally. And like I said, we are not measuring the exposures, and there have been no repercussions for companies to exceed their maximum threshold of pollution as set by their own standards by the U.S. Environmental Protection Act. And it's very important to understand that because our community is right on the border, we actually, as an Indigenous community on the northern side, we are asking the southern side and the American system to hold their companies accountable to their pollution. So we're talking about international strengthening of environmental protections. The research also regarding PCBs in the general research community stopped about 15 years ago. New slide. Now, this is the thing that's really concerning to me and what I wanted to bring to your attention today. So as we know, parent PCB molecules were sold in groups of different PCB congeners or types, and they each had their own separate their qualities. Like some could be more viscous and some more solid, some more liquid. And they were called aerochlor mixtures. And so these were sold by Monsanto. And unfortunately, that's what they are measuring in the environment. And so over time, it's aerochlor that's being measured. They're not measuring the congeners that are related, that are not part of the original parent molecule. The reason that's very concerning is because these parent molecules are actually found to degrade naturally in the environment through natural biological processes by the anaerobic bacteria It just so fine turns out that if you have certain bacteria, they will degrade faster in some areas. And it turns out that we have this problem here in our community. The other concern is because you're not measuring, you don't know what the congeners are, but it also, we are making the assumption that a breakdown product is going to be actually better. And I'd like to say that I'm very unhappy to find out that the breakdown product of PCBs into PCB4, which is a breakdown product, an end product, is actually far different than its parent molecule. Next slide. So as I said, they naturally degrade in the environment. PCB4 is a very simple molecule. It's got two phenyl rings with two chlorines. And they found that these two chlorine rings, if they're at the ortho positions, they are actually found to be more carcinogenic. Now, what's concerning is these molecules are easily aerosolized because they're so light. And there was a tree bark study that was done in 2019 that was done independent of everything else by the community. And they looked at 56 trees around the community, and they tested the bark on trees ages 2 to 200 years old. And they found in all of the trees the presence of this PCB4 molecule. What's concerning is that that's not a parent molecule, and this is a chronic exposure, and it's been going on. And now we are particularly concerned because we don't know much about PCB4. It's not routinely measured, and there's very little research as to what this molecule actually does. However, we know that PCBs degrade faster in heat. They are easily aerosolized. We breathe them in the lungs. They get into our system. They're carried by prealbumin, and they pass the blood-brain barrier. And so I'm very concerned about what this effect is going to be, in 5, 10, 15 years on our general health, in particular because there's very little information at this time. New slide. So what is also concerning, in an effort to curb the greenhouse gases, the carbon-free hydroelectricity that is generated by the Moses Saunders Power Dam, which is just upriver of us on our land, is attracting new industry to the area. And they are using existing infrastructure of the previous factories. And don't forget, these previous factories have been incompletely cleaned of their pollution. And there are two industries that are of current importance. One is the Air Products hydrogen fuel plant, and then the other is the cryptocurrency plant. So PCB degradation, like I said, increases with heat, and it's dispersed easily because it is aerosolized. So anything that increases heat or mechanical forces that can move this molecule through the wind and the water. Next slide, please. So let's start with the air. Cryptocurrency computer servers in the area, they've been put on the previous Alcoa site, and we can see from space there's quite a big heat signature. And so in trying to make these incredible calculations, huge algorithms, the servers get very, very hot. So there's like this heat dome over this in this space that has been incompletely cleaned for its PCBs in particular. And so because of that heat, you're going to increase the degradation of the parent molecule. And because it's so hot, they have to, so that the servers can be cooled down, what they do is they have these huge fans that are pushing the air so that the heat can be dispersed. But 85% of the prevailing winds go over into our community, but also with the mechanical movement of the air with this aerosolized PCB molecules is now going into our air. This has been going on for 5 years. And just last month, this company was given permission to dramatically tenfold increase in the size of their operation with no discussion about its effects on the underlying PCB pollution. So, like I said before, we're not really sure what the pathophysiology of these daughter PCB molecules are, but I know that they are being stored in our fatty tissues, like our myelin and our breast tissues, and in our brains. We know that they are inhibitors and promoters. They are carcinogenic. And so I have many, many concerns. And one of them is that we have to change the lungs cancer screening guidelines to include environmental exposures. Next slide. So we also know that that if you have lighter PCB molecules, they are coming out of the sediment at the bottom of canals, and they can be dispersed through the water. They are polar molecules. They're attached to sediments, and we have all sorts of underwater sediments in this area. And so they move from areas of stagnation and sediment into flows. In particular, we're concerned about this because of air products. This is a hydrogen fuel factory. And what they're going to do is make hydrogen fuel. And as part of this process, they're going to have heated water, 600,000 gallons a day, being poured into this man-made canal, which has several feet of PCB polluted sediment. And we're very concerned because this is going to mobilize just mechanically, as well as increase the degradation of the PCB molecule. And it's going to go by means through breaks in the dams on either side of this canal, as well as the underwater flows into our river system where we get our water. So my concern is we're treating our water. Are we actually assessing it for PCBs? Because some of them do not need to be attached to sediments. Many do. And so my question now, how do you even assess this? So I'm very concerned because our community has been drinking this water for the last 20 years. I don't, we did a Freedom of Information Act, and it took about 8 months for them to get back to us. And they said, oh, no, we're not concerned. The heated water runoff will not disturb the canal's sediment. I don't know how much I trust that. So I really have a lot of concerns about these two factories right now, which are setting up shop and right adjacent to our community. Next slide. So, like I said, the data is not being collected. We have anecdotal rates of illness. I don't understand why there is not much advocacy happening in our community. There are many reasons that I could talk about, but there's no collaboration between the north and the south side or the different departments on both communities. I'm talking about our Aguasasne that is divided by the north and the south side. We absolutely need to make a multidisciplinary plan to address changing exposures, particularly the aerosolized PCBs on our pregnant women and the neurological development of their babies intrautero, infants, children. Its effects on things like breast cancer, which are known to store PCB. And we need also, I'd like to know what the implications are to rapid weight loss when you are redistributing some stored molecule in your fat and suddenly you're on Ozempic and you lose all this weight. Are we actually excreting it in our body, or is it going to be dispersed somewhere else, like in the myelin or in the brains? And the concerning what I'm saying is that with all this weight loss, are we going to have increased problems with liver disease, as well as dementia, as well as problems with nephropathy in the next while? Next slide, please. So we're still eating the fish. We're still drinking and playing in the water. The water's not tested for all of the congeners, specifically the ones that are changing, and the drinking water is not being cleaned. Next slide, please. We always look at risk factors, and as we've said before, risk factors, we talk about genetics and epigenetics. We don't really talk about vertical transmission of different loads. We don't talk about the environmental exposures, including adverse childhood events. We know that this is altering our neuroimmune endocrine axis as well as our mental health. And I'm very concerned about, I don't know, are so many of our young people who are vaping and using these very strong the cannabis, are they increased because of their underlying PCB exposure? Is that why we're seeing increased psychosis? I don't know. Plus, our men who don't have a lot of education have to do blue collar work and they have increased occupational exposures. And this is another interacting effect. We're also not screening because we don't fit the screening criteria because we have these other risk factors that have not been identified. But we seem to only concentrate on behaviors, diet, and activity, which I think is a huge problem that we have in our medical and public health system. Next slide, please. So these are the things that we're doing in the community in Akwesasne. Actually, me and a few people, we still need to figure out all of the different components. I have been reaching out all over the place to try and create a strategy, and that's going to include the north and the south side as well as our leadership. Unfortunately, I'm finding out that not everybody has the capacity, the interest, or the ability to actually hear what we're talking about and our concerns. Next slide, please. And so now we're talking about, going back to the land, trying to create land-based healing and traditional medicine. But what do we do in places where the land is actually not healthy? How do we do harm reduction? How do we try and reinvigorate our culture and our language, which is very much having to do with our relationship with the land and the water? They're really, really big questions. And I'm really, really concerned about the next coming generations. We are all, we have a lot of women who are interested in, doula and midwives and, traditional medicine. And we need to know how to do this in a really healthy way. And that requires a huge strategy from a whole lot of people with benevolence and using their mind to come up with a plan. I'm using this, what happened in our community, as an example because the little intricacies and the concerns of me as a doctor that is not being talked about anywhere else is the same kind of thing that happened with Dr. O'Connor up in Alberta. And it's happening across the board, across Canada, in all these different communities. I'd like to finish by saying that when I was at the doing the Senate testimony in Ottawa back in April for Bill C-226, the gentleman in front of me was from an Indigenous community in northern Manitoba. And afterwards, we talked to him, and he asked, like, where are you from? Like, what's CAPE? So I described what CAPE was, and he said, "How do I join CAPE? How can I, because he had been very frustrated by nobody listening, nobody having the capacity to hear him, and so he was, up at band meetings, and he'd go, and nobody could listen to him, and they'd like basically gaslight him, and he needed a place where people could actually hear his concerns and figure out how to help him advocate for the health of his people." And so that's one of the reasons why we have made the Indigenous caucus. It's for those regional, these community specific, I call them busybodies because they are very, very concerned about their people and they have become independent learners and they are trying to find advocacy in people who can hear and can advocate with a strong voice, and that is why CAPE's Indigenous Caucus was formed. I'm very happy for the support that CAPE has provided this type of story, and I really look forward to seeing you guys in the future at our Indigenous Caucus. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horn, for a powerful and challenging and important presentation. And I know it's something very personal to you, but should be on the radar of all of us moving forward. I want to introduce now Maria Shallard, who is joining us today from the Canadian Climate Institute. So Maria is the Director of Indigenous Research at the Canadian Climate Institute and is a Penelakut and European descent. She was raised in Lilwat Territory in Pemberton, Mount Currie, BC, and currently resides on unceded Comox Territory in Cumberland, BC. She has over a decade of professional experience as an educator, project manager, researcher, and has coordinated programs centered in supporting Indigenous health, education, youth, and climate change policy. She specializes in leading institutional and relational systems change that support reconciliation, justice, and equity from a place of well-being with the land, waters, and with one another. Her range of past work includes leadership positions at the BC Public Service, the University of Victoria, the University of Guelph, and advocacy roles with Indigenous organizations. Maria, welcome. And I'm so happy to have you here. Ojistoh, I'm going to hand it over to you in a moment to sort of kick off this fireside discussion, and I can also participate if you like. But I would love, Maria, to first hear from you a little bit of how that Ojistoh's presentation resonated with you, and maybe a little bit in the context of the work that you do.
Yeah, Aishkoil, Nyalan, Ojistoh, that was a really powerful presentation, and I felt myself moved by a lot of what you shared and resonated with the cross-country examples of how this is happening in many communities. In particular, what jumped to mind, I immediately go to, okay, what actions can be taken? And at the Canadian Climate Institute, we partner with the Centre of Environment and Indigenous Resources on an Indigenous Perspectives program, where we amplify Indigenous-led research, particular case studies, led by authors. And there's a roundtable at the end where we invite important policy decision makers to listen, witness, and we send out a survey after asking people how they'll actually be accountable to what they've heard, to stories like what you've just shared. And it's a funding opportunity. And I was thinking of that, and just wanted to share it because I saw in the strategy presentation that I joined earlier that there's also a focus of how can we partner with other organizations and in particular policy. And I think there's an opportunity here to cross-pollinate and do some really powerful work. But I just really want to thank you for that story and feel really honored to be in this room and to see some familiar faces. Kimia is in Vancouver now, I see. So it's really great. I used to work with Kimia.
Wonderful, thank you. So, Ojistoh, I'll pass it over to you and Maria to have a discussion about this topic. And yeah, thank you so much. I'll pass it over.
Hi. So so I am very I'm happy that there's a lot of it resonates. It's very, very important to recognize that there are people very, very I call them the busybodies because they really know everything. Every community has them. I'm hooked up with the resident busybody and our whole team here. But those people don't necessarily have any purchase with the leadership of the community. There's a disconnect. And that's one of the biggest problems because there are there's so much poverty and economic need in our communities that the leadership, unfortunately, has to make decisions that are actually kind of against the way that they would have made had they not been in so much need because of their poverty. And so we're seeing this across the board. And I was just, when Dr. David Suzuki, in our previous, the little meet and greet at the beginning of this, he said, we stole this land. We're not going to go back to where we came from in the world, basically. We can't empty out the cities, but we could pay rent. And he was absolutely right. We could pay rent and then we would not have to make decisions where we are finding ourselves agreeing to things that are against the environment. We have a right to make those choices, but free, prior, and informed consent, like UNDRIP, means that we are not being unnecessarily cajoled to make a decision like poverty. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I'm not sure what else to add there. I can speak from my own personal experience in terms of poverty, and it does relate to climate change. Intergenerational trauma runs deep in my own family. My grandfather grew up in and out of orphanages, so does his great-grandfather and grandmother, because she was part Penelakut First Nation and was considered quote unquote a half-breed, and people were treated really poorly. I think most people in this room know that history. But we grew up in and out of rental houses, doing what we could to sustain ourselves growing up. And when I was younger, we had a flood in our community just outside Mount Currie in 2003. And I remember talking to my mom saying, "Oh, look, the moon's shining on the field, and it's glittering." And she goes, "Maria, that's the river." And we saw a log flow by. And my mom had just recently been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and it got me reflecting on, the impacts of how to respond in emergency, especially in climate emergencies such as floods, and especially for those most vulnerable. And I think we see that a lot in our communities because we've been placed through the reserve system, especially in vulnerable environments, in summer grounds that weren't meant to be lived in the winter that are prone to flooding continually. And I see that across the country, where the impacts of climate change are really prevalent.
Yeah, part of the reason the impacts of climate change are so relevant, it's not just that we are in those spaces. It's not just because the infrastructure has been designed to be so, vulnerable and weak. It's also because we're actually not part of the emergency response plans of any of the provinces or municipalities. We actually have to make those plans on our own. And that's so you've got you've got your 12, counselors, band counselors who are elected every 3 to 4 years, and they have this massive mandate to provide so many things. And it's the same people making all these decisions about the economy, about, holding, environmental regulations and collecting permits and all this stuff and education and health, like and roads and infrastructure and communications, and emergency services, like holy moly. And we're not integrated unless we make a concerted plan to become integrated with the surrounding municipalities and provinces. And so that's why, and at the end of the day, a lot of people are, we open up, uh, emergency places to go, and you hear about this on the radio and stuff, and like, why are they so not ready? And we don't have a lot of wealthy family members who live in the cities who could take us up and all that stuff. Like there's so many reasons we are vulnerable, not just our infrastructure, not just the poverty, not just because the emergency planning is not at the same level as and not as resourced as what's happening for available for regular Canadians, but also just those are the reasons. I'll stop there.
Yeah. We have a partnership with Indigenous Clean Energy right now. It's a network of individuals that work on the ground in their communities on clean energy projects from coast to coast to coast. And we're looking at Indigenous housing and the intersections with health and how proactively investing in healthier, safe, affordable houses can offset health costs, because we know that, mold risk is high, that asthma risk is high, that people are living in close quarters, and transmission of illness is more severe. And we had a gathering recently because we really want to improve the policies that impact healthier houses that are climate resilient. And you're talking about emergency response. What comes to mind with me is we had a case study working with Chief Patrick Mitchell, from the wildfires that happened in Lytton a couple of years ago. And one of the things that he shared was that bananas were sent right after, and it's cooking hot. It's 40 degrees, and they're sitting in the back of a truck. And people are asked to file claims, after your house is burnt down. And, how do you do that when you have no technology and you've lost everything? So these systems are all very integrated, emergency response, housing, health, and we need to be working together on the solutions to implement healthier houses for Indigenous communities.
Yeah, and it's important that I don't think people realize that we can't get mortgages for to build a new house, and we can't get house insurance in community unless your community has somehow created a relationship with a local bank. There's a lot of problems with just infrastructure. And it's just the way that Canada has been set up, which puts us all the time at an inequity. There's a question here by Warren about about hereditary chiefs and the role of women. So I'd like to just I am Haudenosaunee. We don't have hereditary chiefs where I come from, but I will describe what is an important ethic for our people. We have something called the Women's Nomination Belt, which I wish I had with me. It's downstairs, and this is a wampum belt. And this wampum belt has one little figure in the middle, and then three sets of women on either side of him. And that little figure in the middle is the chief. And what that means is that chief the two women beside him are his bear and his wolf and turtle clan mothers. And they would have seen all the boys and girls raised from little children all the way up through their adolescence and adulthood. And they would have known which ones had become great hunters and orders and, and would be able to be good chiefs for that could best advocate for the needs of the people. And so in the values, using the values of the people. So the women would nominate that chief, and then beside them, the women who are of the other Mohawk communities would then ratify that nomination. And then the women, the clan mothers of the Confederacy, would then nominate that chief. So in the end, that chief was nominated by all the women clan mothers from the Confederacy. The important thing is not just the women who knew these children as they were raised, but those children were vetted and they were part of a process where they were actually really known. So the other part is we have another wampum belt, and it's called the ever-growing tree of peace. And in there, it represents the tree of peace, which we knocked down and put all our implements of war and the reasons we would go to war, which is why you hear the word burying the hatchet. And then we put the tree back up, and there were roots that went in all four directions. And if you wanted to go get shelter under the tree of peace, you could follow those roots all the way to the center and get support from the Confederacy under the tree of peace. Now, when you walked to the tree and you wanted support, you had to accept to go by the peace, which is the Gayrndit Goa. And there are whole ways of doing that. And you could participate in our longhouse and our ceremonies, and you could have discussions, but you could never hold a place of leadership. You would have been wearing your name hung around your neck, and that means that you could participate, but you can never be a leader. And that leadership could only go to your grandchild, meaning that grandchild would have been vetted from when they were very young to the time when they were actually nominated to be a chief. So that whole idea of being having a role of chieftainship comes from being vetted from when you were little. And if you are coming back to your home following the roots, you recognize that you have a place there, but you can never hold a place of leadership. And so these are some two very important ethics that kind of permeate across, Turtle Island. And unfortunately, the leadership we have now is not that way. It is an elected band council system. And so we have people who think one way, and we have an imposed electoral governance system that is from the Canadian government, and they are at odds. And this is the root of why we have so much problems in our community. Are you internally validated or externally validated? And so we have a lot of problems because our ways of knowing and being and governing of ourselves have been completely gaslit and removed and not acknowledged. So when we talk about hereditary systems and we talk about these kind of things, I'm giving you this example to understand how it would have worked a long time ago and why there are so many problems today.
Are there any other questions in the chat? Folks?
I don't see any right now, but I did have an interesting, somebody flipped me an interesting question around the idea of speaking about commercial determinants of health. And these are from the private sector activities that affect people's health directly or indirectly, positively or negatively. I wonder if either of you wants to talk about these commercial determinants of health, how they relate to climate and environment and Indigenous communities.
Did you say?
I'll let you.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if I interrupted. Okay, so the commercial determinants of health is basically the capitalist system that we live in. And that capitalist system is based on a hierarchical structure. It's based on, the rights of some people being more stronger than the rights of other people. Certainly the rights of men more than women, and people more than, children, and more than the rights of animals and domestic over, like there's this wild animals and plants, like there's this hierarchy that exists. And that is reflected in all of the way that the laws that have been put into place to protect that system. And so the capitalist system is protected by a whole judiciary system and all these institutions that have been created to support that those legal parameters, which reflect the inherent rights of this hierarchical, patriarchal system. And that's what we keep fighting about. And, when we talk about externalities are those things that are at the bottom of that list that completely get ignored when you're doing your environmental assessment or you're doing your economic forecasts. So things like indigenous interests, the biodiversity, the future and the environment are not part of that, because you can't commodify that as easily as you can shareholders and their outcomes. And so we're trying to create a commercial or capitalist framework to fix the environmental crisis, but the environmental problems are actually as a result of capitalism. So when Dr. Suzuki talks about, we have to change the way we think, we have to imagine a new way of governing ourselves. And that may not include capitalism. How are we going to do that? We don't have a lot of time to do that. And so right now, the capitalist frameworks are totally ridiculous. You could actually, a company can, buy a whale or a rhinoceros, and they tag that rhinoceros or that whale because they have all this carbon that's stored in their bodies. When that animal dies, that company collects it and they can use it to exchange carbon credits. So what happens if you have an indigenous people who go and they use that animal for their own needs, for their blubber, for their meat or whatever? They're actually can be sued because they took away that money that capitalist, that corporation would have otherwise gotten because of the cap and trade. So that's a capitalist framework that's being put onto a natural system, and so indigenous people are very much at that intersection, and it's not going to work because it's only being directed by a capitalist model. Those are the commercial determinants of health, and we have to figure out how to think differently. I'll stop there. Sorry.
No, I think that's great. It reminds me a lot of how well-being is so central within our communities because it's focused on kinship and relationship. And those relationships have been severed through the commodification of land, of water, in just what you're speaking about in that system. And so revitalization of our own governance systems, I think, is so valuable in this conversation. And there are well-being frameworks that are being used in other places, well-being ambassadors. I'd love to see more movement towards that within our own country. It's got me thinking, when I made my first drum, we have to gift it. I give our first drum away. And I was working with an elder and I said, I don't have a strong connection to my community. My community had been moved to Salt Spring, Chuan. It's called Chuan. And he said, there's always songs to sing. Look out at the tree line. And he asked me to sing to the notes of the trees. And I did that. I was really nervous. But he said, when those trees are cut down, the home to the two-leggeds, to the birds that are in those trees, the oxygen, it's all removed, and so are our stories. And so it brought to me that, that real connection that we have with the land and how important it is. And the land holds those memories. So I think the more that people go back to that, reconnect with yourself and reflect on, I think, everyone comes from somewhere, and reflecting back to your origin story of your ancestors is so important too, in terms of the treaty history here, and treaties that haven't been settled. I mentioned unceded territory, and that means that land has never been surrendered. And so I think that's very important to reflect on.
I think we're talking also about the who stewards the land and how do we take care of it. There is an implicit obligation just by being human that we are here to steward the spaces so that all parts of creation can carry out their original instructions as they came with, because they all have a right to carry out those instructions in a balanced way. So here we are, and we have forgotten that as humans, and we have made ourselves much more important than all of other life on Earth. And of course, as a result, we have this huge disequilibrium. But we have to go back to the idea of taking the honorable harvest, not taking more than we need, not hoarding, not stopping other people from getting the things that they need to survive, like food and water and shelter and foraging and traveling through, and being able to acknowledge that we all need these things, and this honorable heart. Oh yes, and don't take the first, don't take the second, don't take the fourth one, because by taking the fourth one, you're ensuring that there's always going to be something left for the future. Like all these ideas that are very old and they are still relevant, and these can also be incorporated into the ways of thinking. And we could start with our children, and in a generation, we will see changes. But this takes an incredible amount of effort from everybody to recognize how important changing the way we think is vital to the existence of humans.
Yeah, definitely. Just remembering that we're animals as well.
We have a couple of questions in the chat, but also one in the Toronto room. So we're going to go to Toronto first. Please go ahead.
Hi, Ojistoh and Maria. Hi, Ojistoh.
Hi.
It's nice to see you. This is Anjali, the on leave director of CAPE. Your cap and trade example in particular really spoke to me in connection to how the environmental movement has interacted with Indigenous communities, with Indigenous rights over many decades. Mostly, I would say, not extremely well. I'm thinking about the way that CAPE operates and the way CAPE does advocacy, and perhaps the internet room, the virtual room of people here who are campaigners and advocates and have heard now a powerful story from you. And if I'm thinking, Vancouver, you're having trouble hearing me? I'll try to be louder. I'll move the mic closer. So that the mechanism and the sort of way to ensure that our work at CAPE, and we thought about this in the strategic planning and the strategic impact and clarity project, is true to our values here and in alignment with what you're speaking about today. So, I can think about, okay, if we're advocating for a policy, anything CAPE agrees to must be in alignment with free, prior, and informed consent. Like, are there some things that we can talk about that aren't perhaps, all of CAPE suddenly gets in the weeds in Akwesasne, which is maybe not actually perhaps helpful or what you need, or perhaps it is, and you can let us know, but that there's a framework that we can be pushing forward across CAPE's work, that would be meaningful in terms of the impacts in your community and also elsewhere in the country.
So that's an excellent question, because I've been often wondering, well, what can be done? But the most important thing is to hear one story so that you can recognize parts of these stories across the board. And that's why the problem is a lot of people don't have, like I said before, the political, the patience, or the expertise to be able to actually hear. And so this gentleman who's been working for decades up in northern Manitoba has not been able to get anyone to capture what he wants to say. He's not getting capture from his own people, from the community leadership, from Manitoba Hydro. And so he's just like trying to find somebody who can stand beside him and help him. And so this is happening everywhere. And that's why the Indigenous Caucus is so important, because right now it's just a platform. But if people can come and bring their stories, then we can create a strategy to be able to look at this. But we don't have all that information yet. We're still in the truth phase. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, we're still trying to figure out what the truth is. And that's okay. We have to find all that information. And that's what the caucus is about. And then we can inform the strategy that's Bill C-226, and then and different parts of that strategy that will help these individual communities. So right now, I can't answer that, but if we can start trying to, if we can, support the works of the information getting to the Indigenous Caucus, that would be a massive start.
And yeah, that's a great question. We have we're going to take a 2 or 3 more minutes on this session just because we started a bit late and this is such a fulsome and important conversation. Um, this is a question from Tanette, who is one of our staff people. But Maria, I'd love to hear from you on this. And then just if you'd like to add, do you have concerns about the capitalist approach to transitioning to green energy? And maybe you can talk a little bit more about what that transition to green energy has looked like from an Indigenous perspective.
I don't know if I can speak to that so much to be honest. I don't work as much in green energy. I work in, you know, I work with Indigenous communities in housing and energy efficiency. I can talk a little bit about the transition to renewables.
Sure.
I think Indigenous communities across the country are leading the way in terms of transitioning to renewable energy projects. There's some really great youth-led initiatives, and I know Indigenous Clean Energy, that partner I mentioned earlier, runs programs Bringing It Home Project Accelerator that helps support capacity at a community level in developing those projects across the country. There's energy storage happening, here on the West Coast, and Malahat has a big battery project underway, and there's community, I think what's important to remember, and I just sort of spoke about this, is that every community is so unique and different, and a distinctions-based approach is really essential, not only for First Nation communities, but for Métis settlements and Inuit as well. And I think, sometimes people try to pan-indigenize frameworks or ways forward, and it has to be done and Indigenous led, and the needs are so different. So meeting communities where they're at with that transition is incredibly important. But I've been really inspired by the role of youth, and youth play such a strong role in community, and climate change is impacting them first and foremost because they are the leaders of today and tomorrow. And I'm very proud of the work that they've been doing on projects on the ground.
In terms of our youth, the one thing that we could do is to start advocating for high schools on our reserves. Even my community of 25,000 Mohawks, we don't have a high school. So then all of our children have to go off reserve to go to high school. And that means that they get their curriculum through Ontario and through New York State. And none of our needs, our strategic plans, is reflected in any of the teachings the curriculum that they get. So then they graduate and they're like, I don't know what I want to do. And then they go to, maybe they go to school or they go do a trade, and it's not really relevant education. So we need to figure out how to improve the education of our Indigenous youth to be able to be part of this movement, because right now we're not giving them the tools to engender that powerful voice.
Yeah, and I hear so much in working with youth. I used to run an Indigenous youth internship program with the BC Public Service, and it's amazing, how many youth are concerned about climate impacts and how that's affecting mental health. We already have high rates of suicide. I grew up with a class of 32 people from kindergarten to grade 12, and I've lost 13 of my class members. So I've been to more funerals than I have been weddings since I was young. And it's a huge concern. And in terms of response to mental health and its implications, time on land is so important. So that severance from land and from culture, that revitalization is so integral to mitigating and responding to climate change as well.
And I just wanted to say that we are not looking at how the new green revolution and green opportunities and greening the energy is affecting the previous pollution that's in those spaces. And that's why Agwasasne is so important. We have to understand that there's already pollution there. And if we don't have a focus on figuring out how that pollution is going to be redistributed and re-expose these communities nearby, which are mostly Indigenous, then we're even worse off because of the greening of society. And that's why it's so important to have these stories. This is what's happening in lots of hydroelectric dams up in northern Canada, where there's nobody except Indigenous people. So we really have to think about the the externalities that we haven't paid attention to in the past.
Thank you both so much for your incredible words and sharing with us today. So much to think about, and I'd love to continue the conversation again in the future. Maria, thank you for coming and being our guest today as well. I'll pass it back to Melissa, who's going to usher us into our break. But I want to thank you and give an applause to both of you for spending your time with us today.
Yeah, Hi, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you.